Got it. All right, so I'm just going to share my screen. All right. Derek,
Well,
can you, sorry?
yep. I can see your screen just fine, Anthony.
Perfect.
Super excited to chat with you today. Maybe before we jump into deck, I'm happy to share a little bit of background about myself and
Sure.
Susa, and then would love to give you the mic and hear a bit more about your background and your vision for Darroch. How's
Yeah,
that sound?
absolutely.
Awesome. So my name is Derek. I'm a physician by background, healthcare founder, healthcare operator, and now investor that spends a lot of time in healthcare, but also anything touching AI, ML, NLP. From a clinical perspective, I was pursuing trauma surgery. I went to med school at Harvard, came out to the Bay, and was starting residency at Stanford Hospital. Also did an MBA at Stanford, and during business school did several things. Helped start a medical device company in the drug delivery space, making fancy syringes for immunotherapies. I was also part of the early team of a company called Viz.ai, and we build AI algorithms to detect disease on medical imaging. Help take that company from idea to the unicorn that it is today in healthcare. And as it relates to this conversation, did several things at Viz. Helped us get through the FDA, initially through a de novo, built many of our commercial departments and helped us close our first 500 hospitals. And then most notably helped us unlock reimbursement from CMS, becoming the
Mm.
first AI healthcare company to do that. And then during the pandemic, made the transition over to venture. I'm at Susa Ventures, which you already know. And what Susa does is we're an industry agnostic firm, although we spike in industries like healthcare. And we'll invest in everything from pre-seed to Series C. Our quick value prop to founders, and I'm happy to double click into it, is what I call the three C's: capital, customers, and community. We're exceptional at not only helping founders with their current raise of capital, but helping them raise their next round of capital. We've got an incredibly high follow-on rate with top-tier multi-stage funds. From a customer's perspective, we're well-versed in healthcare. My background selling into hospitals. Other members of the team are also well-connected in healthcare, and will do a lot to help make intros, help you develop processes that are repeatable for selling into institutions like hospitals and health systems. And then on the community side, we're very active in bringing founders together. Point in case, last year hosted a digital health retreat in Kauai, brought together founders inside and outside of the portfolio to leverage each other as sounding boards. Just the other day, got back from our Mountain Tech Summit, where we bring together a lot of growth stage founders and investors to build relationships. And we did that in Aspen. So happy to share more about Susa, but with that, would love to learn a bit more about you and what you're building.
Absolutely. So I guess before I jump in, as you know, my name's Anthony. Mindy and I actually went to high school together, and she reached out about a couple months ago to talk about this project, and which we had talked about my company Darroch a while back. And so a little bit about myself. So I went to the University of San Diego. I have a background in electrical engineering and finance. And so the University of San Diego also has a school of nursing. And for our senior project, we were pitched a project from the School of Nursing, which was basically the idea of, can we essentially relay infusion pump information from the pump to a phone, because a lot of nurses had kind of complained of, there's just not a lot of information unless we go into the patient's room. Then as we graduated, we then thought, why would we just stop at presenting infusion pump information? Can we present information from all devices so we could effectively create kind of like a proxy for nurses to almost always feel like they were in the room? And kind of that then took off to kind of opening our repertoire of instruments. And really since then, we've managed to develop and test our system. We've done a variety of other technology and implementing there. And then we've even gotten our FDA pre-submission in and had it reviewed. So when you talk about the FDA process and going through a de novo, I can share that that process is very laborious. It's definitely something that requires a lot of due diligence. And so kind of all the stuff that you've put out definitely sounds like I would definitely love to be a part of. Would love to have Darroch be a part of. My sister is actually also in her residency for trauma surgery in Visalia. So kind of cool to see that connection there. But yeah, that's just a really quick summary of us. We have 5 people on our team, and we're just looking to take that next step and hopefully begin commercializing our system in the next year or so.
Awesome. So I've been able to see the deck.
Mhm.
Very helpful. Thanks for sharing that in advance. I'd love to just kind of jump into things, and maybe
Sure,
we could start with, and you can use slides as a visual aid, of course.
sure, of course.
Maybe we could start with your 2-minute elevator pitch. I love hearing this from founders. What are you building, and why are you deciding to spend your valuable time building this, among all other things?
Yeah. So we've learned that adverse events are one of the biggest problems in hospitals and post-acute care facilities today. And roughly studies have shown that up to 60% of adverse events or unintended injuries can be prevented if healthcare practitioners have access to the medical device data that a patient is connected to, right? And then access early intervention. And what we've learned is that a lot of healthcare practitioners just simply don't have the tools to monitor their patients effectively. And so that's where we created our system, the Beat Analytics system, that pretty much aggregates data from a variety of existing medical instruments and populates all of the information at high frequency and low latency on a mobile device so that healthcare practitioners, whether physicians or nurses, can effectively be at the patient's bedside through monitoring monitoring their medical devices through a phone. I usually keep it pretty short, and yeah, just that's kind of where we've landed at.
Awesome. Tell me more about the technology. Are
Sure,
you building the hardware all in-house? Is this third-party technology that you're using to remotely monitor these patients?
sure.
Help me understand what is proprietary in yours versus off the shelf.
Yeah. So our proprietary platform is developing these hardware attachments that we call dongles that attach to the medical devices physically. I actually have a picture of one of our devices right here. So I'm sure you're aware of Becton Dickinson's infusion pumps. So this little like appendage that you see. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but right to the right of this Alaris pump is the device that we created that appends directly to the medical device and reads the data that's going across those lines and then pushes it out via Bluetooth to a microcomputer, and that microcomputer then spits that data to cloud and subsequently phone. So to answer your question, the proprietary thing that we've developed is this data aggregation piece that collects data directly from the medical instruments. And what we've seen is that's kind of the differentiator or the competitive advantage that we have through 510K analyses or looking at different websites. Specifically, we haven't seen any other devices on the market that can aggregate data directly from medical instruments. Typically, what we see is all medical devices today either force the hospital to buy an entirely new suite of medical devices, or they aggregate data through the electronic medical record, which is problematic in and of itself because EMRs tend to get their data primarily from manual transcription of data from nurses or nurse aides, which obviously opens up the possibility of transcription errors, or if the institution is well funded enough, a vendor specific server that is sometimes really cost prohibitive that batch dumps data every 4 or 6 hours or so into the electronic medical record.
Speaking of the electronic medical record, are you also pushing data to the EMR, or just mobile devices? And help me understand the
Sure.
calculus there.
Yeah, so we would love to implement with or integrate with EMRs. That is definitely in our future in the next iteration of our system. As of now, we are solely pushing to a Darroch provided phone and mobile application, and we wanted to keep it simple for this first iteration through the FDA. Just because we're a new company, we wanted to establish that rapport with the FDA and make sure that they understand that we're a very serious medical device company that's really intent on accomplishing this real time remote and continuous remote monitoring system. And so we have the intention to integrate with EMRs in our next iteration of our system. But for now, it is solely limited to a mobile application that we provide on our own phones.
I see. Why not push to the provider's phone? Why leverage a Darroch provided phone?
Kind of along the same lines of I'm sure you're familiar with the FDA in the perspective that if we were to say, hey, we can connect to all phones, whether that's iPhones or Samsung phones, then we have to test a very large subset of these phones. And while some of our predicates have said that, you know, they can connect to mobile phones, we again just kind of wanted to take a first simpler route of establishing our system with the FDA, and then kind of in the next iteration start adding to the technology that we have available. Because interestingly enough, I don't want to say clinical trial, but our first clinical validation at the University of Toledo Medical Center, they had actually asked if we could integrate with their ASCOM pagers as a way of, helping them access this information. But unfortunately, mostly due to some technology issues within the hospital itself, we weren't able to do that. But with that being said, our intention is to eventually push this to all mobile phones. But because the FDA would then require us to test a good enough subset of all mobile devices, we elected just to keep it simple for now, and then scale up once we get this first 510K through.
I see.
Mhm.
How do you plan to make money?
So we are going to sell directly to hospitals, hospital networks, and post-acute care facilities, and pretty much just go through kind of stay more on the OpEx expenditure side, and really focus on a software as a service model. But yeah, pretty much commercialize directly in community hospitals, hospital networks, and post-acute care facilities.
And in terms of your subscription model, do
Mhm.
you intend to sell on a per hospital basis, a per user basis? Maybe you could double click into the shape of that transaction.
It would be on a per bed basis instead of a per user basis. I think our system would be most effective if it kind of stays from a per bed per institution basis. Now, I think that kind of lends itself to the way our system works. Is since it collects information on a per room basis, it makes the most sense to keep it on a per bed basis. But for that being said, I think a very big possibility is we start small in a hospital, and then as a hospital begins to see the potential of having the system in place, then we can focus on like internal customer expansion, and then get additional beds to be put in place.
Okay. And what do you imagine will be the willingness to pay by hospitals per bed for your technology?
That's definitely something that we're trying to elucidate right now. I think from a outpatient perspective, it's mainly skilled nursing facility, there's a definite willingness to do that there. We've had conversations with a post-acute care facility here in San Diego, and it definitely seemed like they were definitely amenable to either on a unit-wide basis, which would then put it down to the per bed basis. But as a hospital goes, we're mainly targeting step-down units, and basically units where there's a high chance of an ICU readmission from adverse events. And that kind of limits itself to a specific subsect of the hospital. And if the hospital sees that there's value in putting it on other parts of the hospital, we can definitely accommodate that. But that is also something that I'm looking to elucidate with. I have a meeting with the CEO of Mills Peninsula Hospital in the Bay Area in a week or so, where I'll definitely be looking to get that information to see if that's something that's possible.
Okay. Anytime that I look at a software as a medical device company, I'm looking for three things.
Mm-hmm.
One is performance of the technology. Two is ability to navigate the regulatory environment. And three is commercial viability. And you can really think of that third one as two different buckets: go-to-market strategy and then ability to capture reimbursement. So I want to double click into each of those. And maybe we kind of start with the first bucket, performance of the technology. Um, to date, how is your technology performing? What sort of indications are you seeking to get from the FDA?
In terms of performance, we had, as I mentioned earlier, a brief clinical validation study at the University of Toledo Medical Center. So this was pretty much solely a technology and implementation front to see if our system could withstand being put from a pilot, or sorry, from a pure technology standpoint into a clinical standpoint. And we saw that there was a lot of efficacy there from this specific case study. We had a patient who was recovering from pneumonia, and you can see that there's a pretty precipitous drop in their SpO2 levels. And the system was able to alert the nurses that, hey, your patient has dropped below the lower boundary condition that you've put on our system. We're not going to tell you what to do, but just know that the system has now alerted you for this breach in SpO2. When we talked to the nurses afterwards, they took this information and then went to the patient, noticed that this patient had taken off their oxygen assistance, then re-engaged that, and hopefully that did prevent a potential further problem from developing. A second kind of validation that we had was, as you well know, bed falls are one of the biggest problems in institutions today. And kind of what we've seen from technology is that a lot of technology these days is the patient in bed or out of bed. And to us, we kind of wanted to change that into, instead of reacting that the patient's out of bed, can we see if the patient's going to be restless and even think about getting out of bed? And so this case study in particular was a very interesting one from the perspective of, you can see that the variation in vital signs goes really kind of crazy around that 160 or 170 mark, which was 18 minutes before this patient actually got out of bed and fell. Unfortunately, at this point, the nurses did not take this information and prevent a bed fall, but I think it does show the viability of using this information to potentially prevent a bed exit from happening in the first place. So at least from a performance perspective, I think the idea of our system is to alert physicians and nurses into potential physiological changes. Whether those physiological changes are actually something that are clinically significant is up for the practitioners to understand or to figure out for themselves. But we, again, just want to give them that information as if they were always in the room. From an FDA perspective, we're going to go through a 510K. There are a set of systems that are kind of like relatively similar. We'll probably be ending up taking a split predicate perspective. And what we, again, would like to push to the FDA is really almost not a medical device, but since it does monitor patients, this idea of we want to be a redundant monitoring system. Any information that you'd see in the room, we're just forwarding that to a mobile device so that nurses don't have to run around to figure out what the patient's physiology actually is. And if you have a step-down unit that has 1 to 5 or 1 to 6 patients, that you can prioritize your workflow and understand if there are multiple patients declining at once, which one needs priority. So I'm not sure if that fully answered your question.
Yeah, no, it's
but at least
really
for the
helpful.
first two. Yeah.
Well, why not build algorithms that go a step further and detect the fall or provide some sort of insights as to what's going on from a disease perspective?
That is an excellent question. In fact, one of the problems that we did do or try to figure out is that one of our first hires actually was a student trying to understand how he could anticipate sepsis within hospitalized patients, which works great with our system because we collect all this information at really minute-to-minute intervals, with that latency being pretty much less than 5 seconds from when it's measured. And so pretty much in terms of the technology, the algorithms might be great, but the data sets that these algorithms train on, unfortunately, are lacking, right? And when we were trying to make this sepsis anticipation algorithm, we were pulling from EMRs, from publicly available databases such as Mimic3, and kind of the consistency that we saw across all of these data sets was that they were inconsistent. They had too broad of timescales. They didn't have a label for when the adverse event actually happened. A lot of times they were missing values, or just were simply incomplete. And so we tried to do the best that we could with those data sets, but kind of what we saw was that our algorithm was hampered by these poor data sets. And that's kind of why we did make a version of that sepsis anticipation algorithm. Unfortunately, it really only looks at hour-to-hour developments. And while some of these cases patients develop a little more slowly, and that's not necessarily a huge problem for patients that might actually be a little bit more critical, hour-to-hour outputs are still not necessarily the best. And we also kind of saw this play out with, I think Epic released a sepsis anticipation algorithm, but they kind of ran into the same issues where there were a lot of false positives and negatives because the data sets that they trained on were not actually representative of the target demographic that they were targeting. And so to answer your question, that is something that we would love to do. In fact, that's kind of where I see the value of the system really shine. But in order to get there, we have to get the data sets that have consistent timescales, are measured at even as broad as every 15 minutes. At least these data are being calculated or aggregated at consistent timely intervals. For us, really identifying the adverse event onset will probably be the most challenging part of ensuring these systems are robust or these data sets are robust. But I think that can be remedied through hospital reporting or EMR data mining. And then as we begin to move to integrate with EMRs, then we really get to start looking at some of the cool stuff with, pulling that demographic information, obviously being sensitive to HIPAA and all those precursors. But then we get to start looking at pretty cool things of what demographics might be predisposed to certain comorbidities, how certain demographics might adversely react to certain drugs. So that's the second iteration of our system that I think with a first deployment of our system that we can start gathering these data sets. We can really start to look at how to integrate artificial intelligence or AI in adverse event anticipation systems, because you're absolutely right. This is what our system, this first iteration, is really just empowering nurses with timely insights. But let's move the kind of needle from reacting to adverse events to wholly preventing them from happening in the first place. And AI can be just that tool. Just unfortunately, right now, what we're seeing is that the data sets to train these models are just really lacking, for lack of a better term.
Sure. So I get it. Your current iteration of the product is a wedge to building more comprehensive machine learning algorithms that can do more effective triage and detection.
Yeah, you
Very
can think of
helpful.
it that way. Yeah, and that's not to say that having this information wouldn't be useful. I really do think it would be interesting to understand how nurses would respond to this information, because having something tell them that, hey, something might happen, might go different ways for different people, right? Nurses are they're creatures of habit. They're incredibly intelligent. They have a fantastic intuition, and really just our hope is that we can just supplement that intuition, not necessarily tell them exactly what to do. We can tell them like, hey, there's a good likelihood that a patient might experience X, Y, and Z. But we're also curious as to what in the future for this AI or machine learning, what's the best way to present that information? And luckily, we have some nurses that we can pull from to see how that might shake out.
Awesome. In the last 8 minutes that we have, I want to make sure we cover a few areas.
Sure.
One is the competitive environment. Two is your team, and then three is the fundraise.
Sure.
Maybe briefly on competitive landscape. You have a great slide in your deck showing how you're matching up against competitors.
Mm-hmm.
I am interested though, why does your solution win? What makes it defensible? What makes it differentiated? And makes it well poised to be the dominant player in the market?
Yeah, I think this first is this, we're targeting non-ICU units, and ICUs kind of get all the bells and whistles when it comes to new medical devices. But what we've seen from even large hospital networks such as Sutter Health, Sharp Healthcare down here in San Diego, and community hospitals alike is that step down units maybe have a little bit of better technology, but we're targeting existing medical instruments, right? We want to retrofit existing instruments and give them the ability for interoperability without forcing the hospital to get an entirely new suite of medical devices. And I think that's enticing from their perspective of, hey, we can get a lot of really great benefits from the Beat Analytics system, but we don't have to go out and buy an entirely new set of medical devices, and we can keep kind of the same workflow that we have. The second idea is really this idea of aggregating data directly from medical instruments without the need for electronic medical records or vendor specific servers, right? And I think that's really the key advantage that we had. And I think we kind of got this implicitly validated by the FDA when we submitted our pre-submission, because they were like, hey, you guys are aggregating data from an infusion pump using a dongle. There's no predicate for that. And that's not necessarily a problem, but hey, you might have to do a little bit more testing on the battery of the infusion pump just to make sure that your system really does provide the benefits that it's saying without introducing any potential negatives. But for the original idea of aggregating data directly from medical instruments, I mean, if you're getting that data from the instrument as it's being measured, that's as quick as you're ever going to get. And if in really EMRs, what we've seen, they're kind of limited by the ability of these medical devices to stream data to their server and then from the server down to the EMR. That latency can be as great as 4, 6, 8 hours because the EMR itself was never designed to handle that kind of data. And really, I think the last bit of direct medical device integration that differentiator that we have is we're now looking at data that is tremendously useful in potentially preventing adverse events, but it's actually not shown on the screen, right? So, for example, bed scales. Each patient lays on a bed, but right now, as we kind of mentioned earlier, the bed just simply tells you patient is in bed, patient is out of bed, and if the patient's out of bed, well, you're kind of already losing the game. And one of the devices that we've connected to is actually we've connected to the load sensors on each 4 corners of the bed. We can measure the variation in those load sensors to potentially look at whether a patient is getting restless, right? If the variation in those load cells is relatively negligible or close to 0, then the patient's kind of sitting still. But if there's wild variation from all 4 load sensors, there's a good chance that that patient's getting restless, and perhaps we can use that information to preventing bed falls from happening in the first place. So really this idea of targeting non-ICU units for this specific technology, retrofitting existing instruments so that hospitals don't have to take on an immense capital expenditure, and then finally using proprietary dongles to integrate data from medical instruments without the need for EMRs or vendor-specific servers, I think is really this trifecta of competitive advantages that's really going to sneak up on some of these bigger players.
Helpful. Briefly, why is your team the right team to build this?
I think we're like at its very core, we just want to see we want to create a system that was going to better the human condition. And so this story that I usually tell is not directly related, but so Colby, our chief technology officer, had an AVM, if you're aware, that's an arterial venous malformation. And he had to get brain surgery like immediately. And again, this isn't a direct tie into the exact problem that we're going for, but on the eve of or not the eve of the surgery, but like a week before the surgery, as he was getting transferred from hospital to hospital, his mom noticed that his doctors had marked the incorrect side of his brain to be operated upon. And while that did get caught and that did eventually move closer to getting that fixed, and he's made a full recovery since, I think we had a moment when he told us that, and I was like, man, if these potential issues can happen in a less stressful environment, we can only really imagine what happens in a stressful environment. And then again, since the University of San Diego has its own school of nursing, we were listening to a lot of their issues that they had, and kind of what we heard was just there's just not really any system that we can use to understand the patient's physiology unless we go in the room. And so us pretty much only really being as engineers, we thought of this great solution and we created it. And then, we surrounded ourselves with former hospital administrators, nurses, physicians, scientists, people from the business sector to really then elevate ourselves and put us on the right path to being able to commercialize the system. And I wholly understand that our team is very young, but I think that in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing, and we're really intent on trying to fix this problem because it seems like there is a simple solution to do so, but we've learned that it kind of takes a new and novel approach to potentially fix it. And instead of using EMRs or using traditional technology that has been lacking, to say the least, I think what this kind of market needs is a fresh take on how to solve this problem that isn't tied to traditional kind of problems or solutions that might have already been introduced.
it sounds like you're passionate to solve this problem. Um, I'm curious to transition over towards the fundraise.
Mhm.
How much capital are you raising, and what do you plan to do with it? Or
So
rather, what
we
do you plan to achieve with it?
Sure. So we're looking to do a, whether you want to call a seed round or a Series A round. It's going to be preferred equity of around fundraise about $4 million. Now, 25% of that will go to the process of clearing and commercializing the Beat Analytics system, as I mentioned through the 510K. 10% goes into there's a wearable vital signs monitor that we're going to test at a post-acute care facility here in San Diego. 10% will go to the pilot and going through the FDA clearance of that. Now, 50% or just shy of 50% will go to the expansion of our team. As I mentioned, we're 5 engineers, and some of the first hires that we'll be making are a dedicated director of medical affairs, people to kind of round out the team to have more clinical expertise rather than just solely having it on our advisory board or board of directors, additional engineers and regulatory personnel, et cetera. And then that last 25% will be dedicated to the robust development of the development of our early warning and adverse event anticipation system, because a lot of that work, as I mentioned, is still kind of just aggregating those data sets to then be used. And we have done a lot of that implicit work already. And it's just kind of, again, getting those data sets to tweak our models to fit that specific niche. Integration with Epic and Cerner, and then additional medical device integration so that we can connect to more medical instruments for a variety of different hospitals. So that's kind of a quick and dirty version of what we intend to use for these proceeds.
Very helpful.
Yeah,
So next steps on my side from a Susa perspective, we like to keep everything down to a few steps. So one is a discovery meeting, two is diligence meeting, and then three is an all investor or partner meeting. This very much satisfies discovery meeting. So what I'll be doing after this call is having a conversation with the team. And if folks are leaning in, we'll move to a second meeting, which will be much more oriented around the white hot risk of the business. And it's oftentimes during that meeting that you'll see how Susa can be most helpful, because we'll have a deep conversation around go-to-market strategy and how the technology is being valued by the different stakeholders that are going to be using it, but also purchasing it.
sure.
I do want to give you a moment to ask me any questions that are top of mind.
Um, to be honest, I took a pretty thorough look through Susa Ventures portfolio. I love that you guys are kind of focusing on the whole spectrum, really with seed series all the way to Series A, or Series C. So to be honest, I actually don't have too many questions. It sounds like Susa Ventures could be a fantastic resource for us, and we hope to work with you all, especially because you guys have so much experience in this sort of space. That could be really, really be useful to us five who are just hungry to make a change.
Awesome. Well, hey, I'll be in touch shortly. And should we proceed to a next meeting, what would be really helpful for that is to demo the technology, actually
Sure,
see it, feel it. And if you're able to have any of your other team members on the call,
absolutely,
it would be a wonderful opportunity to get to know them too.
awesome. Well, that sounds good. I'll look out for that email.
Awesome.
Sweet. Well, I hope you have a good one. And yeah, hope we'll
Thank,
see you soon.
thank you for your time, Anthony. Bye
Absolutely.
for now.
See it. How do I close this?